Alright, in this lesson we're going to start to take a little bit more in-depth look at the 3ds Max Compact Material Editor. Alright, so we're going to pick up right where we left off in our previous lesson. So let's talk a little bit about some of these different preview slots and how we can actually begin connecting in things like textures and maps and things like that. So if you select any material within the preview slot and start to scroll down, you notice that there's a lot of these parameters that have some kind of a little box next to them. Now what this means is that there's some kind of a map that can be connected directly into that. So let's say, for example, that with this blue material, we wanted to give this some kind of a transparency map. So all we have to do is go down to the opacity, which is the attribute that we're looking for in this particular material. Now, depending on which material you're going to be using, some of these different parameters are found in different areas. But for the standard material, it's going to be found under opacity. So just click on the box. That'll pull open the map browser. So now we can start to look for any kind of a material that we want to plug in here, or any kind of a map that we want to plug in here. So let's say, for example, that we used maybe just a simple checker. Just select that, press OK. And now you can see that we're working with this map, which is map 8. You can see this has been mapped into the transparency. So within this area, now we're working with the actual checker map itself. So within this area, this is where we can start to get into tiling and things like that. So you can see right now it just tiles once, which means we have a white square here, black, and black. So we're using black and white values within this map to actually control the transparency. So if we wanted this to maybe repeat, you can see by increasing the tiling, you can see we're actually making this repeat a few times. If we wanted this area to maybe be not quite so transparent, we could actually give this some kind of a slightly gray value. So you can see as we start to bring this down to a black, that's actually introducing more transparency. So what you have to be careful of is that some of these different parameters are named a little bit differently depending on which material you happen to be working with. So if you want to get back to the material itself, all we have to do is pull down where it says map 8, and now we can go back up to the parent node, which is the actual material itself. Now this standard material will use the parameter called opacity, which means that if something is more opaque, that means it's more solid. If something is non-opaque, that means it's basically transparent. So if we're to follow this connection, if something is completely black, that means it's not opaque at all. So by making that non-opaque, that means it's essentially transparent. Now, some other different materials call this parameter transparency. Now, transparency means something completely different because transparency means its ability to be seen through. So in the case of transparency, instead of black being 100% transparent, black would mean 100% opaque. So really pay attention to the naming of your parameters depending on which material you happen to be working with. So in our case, let's come back and start to maybe introduce a little bit more white into these areas, and maybe a little bit more of a gray into these areas, so that way it's not 100% transparent. Right? And that's pretty much how we can start to connect some of these different maps together. Now, what we can also do is start to take some of these different materials and actually begin duplicating these. So let's say we had this orange material and we wanted to kind of use this as a starting point and maybe plug in a different map or maybe make some very minor modifications to this. Well, you'll notice that there's actually not a command in here that will allow us to duplicate a material. Instead, all we have to do is take an existing material, drag it from one material slot into another, and now this has essentially made a duplicate. Now this one, you'll know, is the duplicate because there's no triangles in any of these corners, which means this is not being used currently by anything in our scene. So now, all we'd have to do is take this and begin making modifications to it. Now this is one of these situations where, just like I mentioned a moment ago, you'll notice that this particular material that we're using, which is a ray trace material, instead of having the opacity parameter, this one has a transparency parameter. And you can see completely black means there is no transparency at all. So let's come into this material, maybe give this a slightly different color. Right, and just like that, now we have a duplicate material that is a little bit different. So all we have to do is take this one, drop it onto our object. Now whenever we do this, it's going to present us with a warning that says there's already something in this scene that uses this same material name. So you'll notice, if we were to hover our cursor over this, this is named Material 56, but this one is also named Material 56. So 3ds Max is starting to get now a little bit confused over which one of these materials should be used. So to resolve that, just make sure you take your duplicate material and give it some kind of a unique name. So we'll call this something like green material. Now we can take that, drop that into our scene, and Max knows exactly what to do with it. So now if I render this again, just pressing Shift-Q, and there we are. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is we can actually use these different slots to store more than just materials. We can actually store textures within these as well. So let's say in this green material that I wanted to actually use the exact same transparency map that I have over in this blue material. Well, there's really no way to get the material or any kind of a map from this one directly into my green material. So all I have to do is I'll take this map. You can see the little M icon next to it. I'll just take this, click, and drag it up into one of my preview slots. It's going to ask me if I want to make this an instance or a copy. I want to make this an instance because I want to take this exact texture. So I'll move this as an instance, and now you can see this preview slot is now holding the map instead of the material. So now, if I go back to my green material, all I have to do now is take this map, drop that right into my transparency. Again, we'll just connect this as an instance, and there it is. All right, so if we were to come in here and let's say just right-click on one of these slots, we can see we can actually choose to make these thumbnails a little bit smaller. So we have a few different layouts here to choose from, but you can see that really we only have 24 different slots to be able to work with. Now, one very, very common question that people will ask is, well, since I only have 24 slots, does that only mean that I can have 24 materials in my 3ds Max scene? Well, no, we can actually have as many materials as we want in our scene. This only means that we can preview only 24 materials at any one time. So, again, as I mentioned in the previous lesson, this by no means represents the entirety of your materials. This is strictly an area for previewing the materials that are in your scene. So again, we can have as many materials as we want. It just so happens that we can only preview up to 24 at any one given time. So what were to happen if we somehow managed to fill up all 24 of these slots? Well, let's just go back to a 3x2. Let's say that this represents our entire material library. So everything's full and we still want to add some more materials. Well, all we would have to do is just take one of these existing material slots. Now, if we were to come in and begin making adjustments to this material, it would actually change this material and change anything else that is using that. But if we were to come in, take this, drop this onto another preview slot, now we have a material here that's not being used by anything at all in the scene. So now we can come in, take this one, and turn it into a completely different material. So let's say perhaps a car paint. Press OK. And that's how we can start to work with more materials, even if we happen to have filled up all of our different material slots. Right, now before I wrap up this lesson, there's a couple of additional things I want to point out to you. There's a lot of situations where it can be really, really useful to actually be able to select certain objects based on the material. We can see right now that we do have a material that's loaded up. It does have the little triangles in the corner, which means this is being used by something in the scene, but it may not always be immediately apparent exactly what is using that material. So a lot of times what I find useful is what we can do is just basically select one of these materials in the preview slot, go up to Material, and then select by material. Now what this will do is take whatever material we have selected. That'll pull open this Select Objects window, and it will select Sphere 001, which is whatever we currently have applied to this material. So now with this highlighted, all we have to do now is press Select, and now this should be selected in our scene. So really quick and easy way of actually finding out which objects are using any particular material. Now, if at any point in time we start to begin working with materials, it's pretty much inevitable that you're going to wind up having a few leftover materials, some things in here that aren't being used. And you can definitely tell which materials those are because, again, they're not going to have the little triangles in the corner. So a really quick and easy way of telling 3ds Max to just take all of our unused materials and throw those away and clear those out is to just go up to Utilities and Condense Material Editor Slots. And now you can see that any of these materials that were not being used by any objects in our scene have now been cleared away. Alright, so over these last couple lessons we've had a chance to take really just a pretty introductory look at this material editor, or if you're using 3ds Max 2011 or later, this is now referred to as the compact material editor. This is one of these areas where the more you use it, the more you'll start to get familiar with this. So if we do have 3ds Max 2011 or anything that is later than that, we also do have access to the Slate material editor, and this is what we're going to take a look at in our next lesson.